episode of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. Our guest today is Mark Coleman, a colorectal surgeon in the UK. Mark has, throughout his career, developed a passion for education and teaching and has been the chairman of the Lapco, laparoscopic colorectal training program, the national program in the UK for a number of years. Something that I was connected with in the very early days. Alongside that, he's had a passion for cars of all sorts and has quite a collection to talk to us about. So we're looking forward to have him join our conversation today. And without further ado, let's hand over to Mark Coleman. This is Surgeons' Lives, and I'm John Monson. Well, welcome, Mark. Thanks for taking the time out of your life to talk to us today on another episode of Surgeons' Lives, which is a podcast that really wants to talk to surgeons not just about their career, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also the other side of their life.
Yeah, apologies for my unsalubrious background.
No, not at all. I just did a recent episode talking to Fabio Patenti, who is currently sitting near the Panama Canal on his catamaran, preparing to sail across the Pacific.
Well, I feel even less of a man now.
Yeah,
sitting
exactly.
in my office at work on a Friday night. But yeah.
No, it's exactly right. That is quite a passion to deliver. So normally what I do, just for everybody's benefit, is to a little bit of set the scene by asking you to tell us a little bit about your life, starting with the words "I was born in."
Well, I was born in Barnet, London.
And what happened then to get you to where you are today?
My parents exported me to South Africa for 10 years. My father was a founding professor of anesthetics in Durban in the 60s and 70s, and amongst other things, set up the cardiothoracic anesthetic unit in Durban. So we were there for 10 years. He's a petrol head as well, and Englishman. Mother's a South African, and we were there for 10 lovely years in the wonderful weather and great surroundings. Yeah.
And did you return, or they return, or what?
Yeah, they made a career move and a sort of a social move in the time of apartheid. My mother actually grew up in South Africa and realized that it wasn't for her, because her eyes were opened by emerging awareness of the wrongs of apartheid, and decided this wasn't the place she wanted to bring her children up. So at the age of 10, we came to a grey and murky island in the North Atlantic. Yeah.
Yeah. And where did you move to? Were you still in the South?
Yeah, my first place of residence was Northwick Park Hospital, and then we moved to the suburbs of northwest London. That's where my father had his the later stages of his career. Firstly, doing a lot of NHS work, and then in private practice. Yeah.
Right. And were you always destined, do you think, for doctoring, or just from the family business?
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather in South Africa was a cardiologist, and being a child of little imagination, I conceived of nothing else. And when back in the day, if you remember, a lot of operating theatres had viewing galleries.
Yeah.
And when childcare was thin on the ground, I would be put in the viewing gallery at Northwick Park Hospital at the age of about 11 or 12, watching, orthopedics or a skin graft or something like that. And so I guess it was in the blood early on.
Yeah, that's an interesting introduction. And I'm sure the psychiatrists would have a field day with that in terms of potential PTSD or whatever.
Never put me off, and I was also a patient undergoing appendectomy in the hospital. So yeah, I guess it was always there.
Um, and so, where did you go to medical school?
I went to Leicester. I had to retake my A levels, and the only offer I had ever had was 3 A's in Leicester. So I retook, got them, and went off. So never too far from home, an hour and a half up the M1.
Yeah, it is interesting, when you talk to people in things like this, or just in general in your professional life. There's a perception that all surgeons, are the creme de la creme in terms of A levels and scores and exams, etc. And it's simply not true. I mean, people, come at it from different directions. Um,
Absolutely, and I would describe myself at that stage as being remedial and struggling to get the last place in the country to study medicine. So I was sort of determined, but fortunate at the same time, and went
yeah,
off
I
and had a
was.
had a good time.
I chatted, did one of these with Professor John McPhee, who I'm sure you know well.
Yep. Mm,
And his determination, and I'm paraphrasing, was fueled by the fact that he had a very successful brother, elder brother,
mm,
and he himself, John, had failed the 11 plus.
mm,
So this gave him a determination and something of a chip on his shoulder,
mm,
to that drove him through his career.
mm.
So you always knew you wanted to do surgery when you were in medical school, or did you flip and flop?
Mm. No, I flipped and flopped a bit, and in fact, for some reason still unknown to me, I did quite well at pediatrics in the fourth year, the beginning of the fourth year, and then through that year I did other things, including orthopedics. And by the end of that year, I was determined I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon, and that really carried me through final year and house jobs, as they were called, in Leicester, and off I went doing various SHO jobs. I don't know if you remember in the 90s there was something called Achieving a Balance in the UK, where they dissolved all the SHO rotations
Mm.
almost overnight, and we were left with doing our own 6 month jobs. So I went
Yeah,
round the houses to places like, well, I did anatomy demonstrating at Charing Cross in London, and then casualty, or what's known as ED now, and then went off to Cambridge, did orthopedics, and then down to Guildford to do some urology and general, and really through locuming as a demonstrator, a lecturer in anatomy, I realized that maybe orthopedics didn't quite have enough diversity and skills challenge for me, and I wanted to be a general surgeon, particularly a GI surgeon. Yeah.
it is interesting. The history of the NHS, and indeed many healthcare systems that are single payer systems, are replete with genius workforce ideas. I remember a former CMO, Ken Kalman, who I'm sure you
Mm.
recall very well,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
was a surgeon by training. Um, Ken
Mm.
Kalman said, everybody should have a series of badges, lapel badges saying, I survived the reforms of 92, etc. And,
Well, and 95, because I was then subject to Kelmanization, having become an old style registrar and having done the old style primary FRCS, and then had to do the new style part two. And then I was told that wasn't good enough. I had to do the intercollegiate part three. And then we were Kelmanized into SPRs, as they were known,
yeah,
specialist registrars. And so and then there was a question over whether we should do a period of research, and some trainees were reasonably going through training without doing so. So, every era is characterized by change, and every
yeah,
time the new lot come along, they say, "Gosh, there's so much change going on." We say, "Well, I do remember times when change happened in my day as
Sure.
well." So yeah.
And the intriguing thing about, as you say, and it happens everywhere, I think it's a human condition, is that one thing that also doesn't change is the inability to recognize the mistakes of the past and to simply repeat them under a different
Yeah,
guise, you know?
absolutely. Those who don't learn from their errors are condemned to repeat them. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned your dad was a petrol head, or
Mm.
how did that manifest itself?
Well, he when he was at medical school at St George's in London when it was on Hyde Park Corner, and he was an enthusiast at the time, and they were racing Austin Sevens around Hyde Park Corner in the days when you
Yeah,
merely got a telling off by a bobby.
yeah.
And when he came out post house jobs to South Africa, I may have had one of the only MGAs, bright red, in Durban and Natal, and met my mother. And there's a few photos of him standing with one of the old long surfboards by his MG. And then there wasn't any form of anesthetic training in South Africa, so they came back to the UK where I was born. Then they went back out, and then he exported. You couldn't buy MGs at the time in South Africa. Not everyone's cup of tea, but he exported a chrome bumper British Racing Green MGB
Hmm.
in the early 70s, as I recall. And as far as I know, friends of family still have the car in a lockup somewhere in
Wow.
Johannesburg, and I'd
Wow.
dearly love to bring it back to the UK. I should
Yeah.
think it's probably quite well preserved if it's been in the Transvaal. But again, a beautiful and collectible car
Yeah, and
nowadays. It's in good nick.
a car that it's kind of fashionable to underrate,
Mm,
because it's not very exotic, and they made a lot of
yeah,
them, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it had
yeah.
quite a few of the deficiencies, but it is an underrated car. I mean, it's
Mm,
to coin a phrase that is used in the UK from. It does exactly what it says on the tin, you know. I
yeah,
mean,
and it's got a racing pedigree, and it's got a almost unmistakable sound from its engine,
yeah,
like an original Mini. You can't mistake an MGB coming. I think it used to have twin SU carbs
yeah.
and a characteristic exhaust note, and unmistakable, as you say. Mm.
And so when did you start dabbling? I mean, there is in almost, in the interviews that I do with people who have a car interest, or shall we say an expensive interest, you know, well, boats and
Yeah.
planes,
Mm.
are the same thing. I
Mm.
always repeat, Nick Mason's statement when
Mm.
he said, how did you start buying cars? And he said, when I started earning a lot of money. So not having money is a little bit of a damper for the vast majority of people who have a car collecting interest. But
Mm.
so, when you went to medical school or your house jobs, etc., what was your mode of transport then?
Well, my father bought me a 15-year-old Vauxhall Viva HA in Monza Red. Uh, it would, with the wind behind, achieve 50 miles an hour down the M1 on the way to and from home. And I remember him teaching me to do things like change the brake pads with drum brakes, as I remember, certainly on the back, how
Oh
to change
wow,
the
yeah,
drums. And then I had an HC, a Vauxhall Viva HC in sky blue, and I think that had disc brakes at the front, and we would change the brake pads and bleed the brakes. Those sort of simple tasks on the driveway at home. So those were some of my first experiences of cars that Dad bought. He usually tapped up an ODP at work, and an operating tech who was selling a car and couldn't get
ah,
much money for it, and he would offer them a few hundred quid and do them a favor and take the car off their hands, and we'd sort of think what kind of little sports cars Dad bought us next, and it was usually something unromantic like a Vauxhall Viva or a Chrysler Avenger. Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Mm.
My dad was a car mechanic, and sold cars on the side from a small, side of the road lot, and when I was in medical school, he would provide me with the car, but the main characteristic was that it was so bad he didn't want it seen around him. So
Exactly.
most
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
of the cars came with sidebar instructions,
Mm.
such as you might want to pump the brakes regularly. And I remember I had an 1100 Austin, that thing that used to go up and down like a boat.
Yeah.
Um, that one, the instructions were to always carry water.
Yeah.
Um, so, so they were
Happy
not,
days.
they were not the
Yeah.
exotic cars of that you see nowadays, young
Mm.
kids getting,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. Um, so I must say I love the Vauxhall Viva in Monza red.
Mm.
The irony of calling it Monza red is
Absolutely. Absolutely.
fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. I
um,
wish I had a photo. I've probably got one buried somewhere amongst albums.
so
Mm.
when did you purchase what I would refer to as your first indulgence, either overt indulgence or covert indulgence?
So that would be an original 1976 Mark One Golf GTI Volkswagen,
Uh,
manual, 1600, four-speed. Some people argue the best VW
yes.
Golf GTI, the
Yeah.
original one, in the flame red with the tartan seats, if you remember.
Yeah, I do.
A absolutely great car, and I really enjoyed that. And that was at about the time I sort of inherited a car temporarily. I had a younger brother who did quite well as an estate agent, but had a habit of losing his license. He was a bit naughty. And so every now and then I'd have a hand me down from him when he couldn't drive. Something like an MG Metro Turbo. You remember those with the
Yes. Mm,
A series engine with a little turbo strapped onto it? Deeply unsexy and
yeah.
probably not many left on the road because they all rotted to pieces. But after that, my first purchase was the Golf GTI as a house officer.
I actually had a Series 1 GTI when I was working at the very beginning of my SHO career in Dublin, and it lasted,
Mm,
this is the beginning of the 80s, and it lasted about a year
mm.
before it was stolen and written off. And Dublin at that point was the joyriding capital of Europe.
Yeah,
And the kids were smart enough that they were kids that were doing it, and they never stole. They would never steal an MG Metro. They were always BMWs and GTI Golfs and things like that. It
yeah,
was a great car, that thing, but
yeah, yeah.
sadly, sadly, was found smoldering on the side of the road somewhere.
Mm.
Um, and but now you've got a fantastic collection of things which are really quite eclectic. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I'm quite. I like. I'm not really stuck to any particular brand or indeed country, and I like Land Rovers. I've got two older Land Rovers and a Range Rover, and enjoy those. And I enjoy doing a bit of tinkering on them. I learnt a lot about fiddling with cars in lockdown, for example, using the Bible known as YouTube,
yes,
which
yeah,
teaches you many things about cars. I still don't have enough time to do as much as I would like with cars, but it's
sure,
so I
yeah.
have to subcontract a lot of that sort of thing, unfortunately. But time will tell.
So
It's a timed approach.
when you finished your excuse me, your surgical training, you obviously decide. Well, answer me this actually. Had you decided you were going to be a colorectal surgeon, or did it emerge?
Well, no, I did decide pretty much early on in my registrar training. I was in Salisbury in '95. I had an Alpha 75 twin spark. Managed to leave too little antifreeze in it, and it went down to -20 and cracked the heads. So were aluminium.
Ooh,
That was a write-off.
Yes.
Anyway, so by then I decided, I happened to meet a Australian surgeon who offered me a fellowship later on in my training in upper GI HPB. And I lied, went out there, pretended I wanted to do upper GI HPB later the same decade, and had a great year, but always wanted to do colorectal, and worked for people like Bill Heald and so on to cement that experience and training.
So, and where were you in Australia?
I was in Brisbane.
In Brisbane.
Brisbane, yeah,
So people
yeah,
like Russell Stitz and people were around there at the
yeah.
time, guessing.
John
Yeah.
Lumley, Andrew Stevenson,
Yeah.
but I was working for uh, Les Nathanson,
Yes.
famed for his liver retractor, great
Exactly.
surgeon, one of the technical gods in my view. George Fielding, a real doyen of bariatric surgery of his day, and Nick O'Rourke, we did the first laparoscopic liver resection in Australia whilst I was out there. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a great year, great fun, full
George
cast.
is another interviewee on this podcast, who, as you will recall, has the most extraordinary knowledge of wine, um,
Yes. Mm.
and has literally just retired in the last couple of months, um,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
from clinical
Well,
practice.
there was one time he owned a Maserati Gran Turismo, and he turned up at a restaurant, and when he got back in the car, the engine would start, but when he pressed the throttle pedal, nothing would happen. The engine wouldn't rev. So he said, "What can you do?" And I reached under the dashboard, and being a Maserati, it had a lot of Fiat spare parts. So I reached under the dash and reattached the throttle cable linkage, which was a little widgety screw, not much more. And he was so amazed. He gave me his car for the weekend, and even paid for the speeding ticket I got when I was driving it around for the weekend. He was a very generous man, and it was a good story. Yeah.
So, just educate me. So, at the time that you were completing your training, um, you gained your colorectal expertise, as you say, with people like Bill Heald and one thing or another.
Yeah.
Was that just before the sort of heavy formalization of fellowships came along? That
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
now
Yeah. I
universal.
mean, I was made a consultant in 2001. Just before that, I was examined for my intercollegiate exam by a
Yeah.
guy called Professor John Monson
Yeah.
in Glasgow, and yeah, he was a difficult
Whatever
man.
happened to him?
Exactly. Yeah, and yeah, so the big wave of laparoscopic fellowships in particular came along I think about 2003, because we were a center in Plymouth for the Ethicon sponsored fellowships through the associations
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
coloproctology and laparoscopic surgeons. And I wanted a fellowship in the 90s, but none such existed in the UK, at either end of the GI tract, and I went to Australia. But it was a great experience and huge numbers of
Yeah.
cases. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I visited Brisbane around that same time. When I was in Hull at that point, as you know, from '93 on,
Mm,
and
mm,
we created what was in effect a laparoscopic fellowship because of just of the
mm.
size of the program there, at
Yeah,
the time. And people like John Griffiths were fellows, and et cetera, et
that's
cetera.
right. Good friend
Um,
of mine. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I know John's a special for sure.
Mm.
So what do you think? And so 20 plus years you've been a consultant in the NHS, and I ask this question of people regardless of where they are, geographically, either side of the Atlantic. But what do you think has been the biggest change in surgery in your time, either for the better or for the worse?
Well, I think probably the biggest change is the way that we work now in a horizontal form of hierarchy, where you're much more dependent on your consultant colleagues. and you don't work within a traditional firm of consultant residents and interns or registrars and house officers, as we call them in the UK. And the whole sort of hierarchical system in the operating theatre has been exploded into much more of a team working environment, which is said and evidenced to be safer than how it used to be. And obviously the old hierarchy had the potential danger where a surgeon didn't have the necessary technical or non-technical skills for it to be unsafe. And I suppose one could argue that's no longer the case in the right places and with the right practices. Um, I think, politics and managers have become much more interfering in terms of the development of healthcare. The old system where a consultant had a diary and a secretary and ran their firm and knew all their patients on their waiting list and oftentimes knew the dates that their surgery was coming up. Sadly, that's gone, and we're just much more employees than we would like to be now, I think. So it's a very different relationship between us and our employers than it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that people give different answers to these questions, obviously, because it's through the prism of their own experience to some extent. I do recall, at the time when the new consultant contract was being debated in the UK, which introduced the concept of actually managing your time, as in where are you, those notional half days and clinical days and non-clinical days. And it struck me at the time, and it was proven to be right, but not because I was a visionary, but because I think it was pretty obvious that it was, the danger was to deprofessionalize the way people behaved. The transactional deal for consultants in the NHS was, for many years, work very hard, above and beyond in the vast majority of cases, in the most difficult of circumstances, restricted resources, not everything was perfect. And in return to that, everybody understood you were doing your best. The patients understood, the administration understood, and indeed, to an extent, the government understood. But once people started being asked to clock in and out, I always thought that was a massive mistake. And, immediately that happened, what I saw when I was still working there was that people said, okay, if you're going to treat me like, a factory worker, I'm going to behave like a factory worker. I'm not having a meeting at 5:30 or whatever, because I'm done now. And I thought that was a huge error. I'm totally blanking on the name of the Department of Health admin guy who did it, Andrew something, but it was a catastrophe.
Lansley, yeah,
Huh?
yeah,
No,
Andrew.
no, he was a minister. No, this guy was an administrator. He was a
All
human
right,
resources guy. And I always
yeah,
remember he got, naturally, after the catastrophe with the reduction in productivity and the increase in
yeah,
costs, he was
yeah,
knighted,
yeah.
of course.
Of course, as you do. No, I think you're right, and the thing is that we're generationally got a foot in both camps. We're aware of what it was like before, and we're certainly aware of what it's like now. And but you do see that our younger colleagues who are very, very much brought up post millennium
Hmm.
in terms of training and consultanthood are much more transactional. And I go
Yeah,
into work and I go home, and you ask them to pick up additional activities, and it's very much on their own terms rather than thinking
yeah,
of the provision and needs of the service. And as currently as the service line director for colorectal, it's difficult because you can't pressurize people unduly, because they have a different mindset to ours.
You mentioned the use of term millennials, etc., and as you say, they are more transactional, and but quite specifically, they're much more interested in what might be loosely termed a work-life balance,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that in isolation is a good thing.
Yeah.
In my day, surgeons did not talk about a life outside of surgery other than playing a round of golf, and it was almost perceived as being a sign of weakness that you would be off doing some frippery, etc. And you absolutely would never have discussed issues such as stress,
Yeah.
and anxiety and all of that sort of stuff. And I'm sure that was not good.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why, I wanted to do these podcasts to really just, raise the rock a little on that, surgeons are there is another side to their life. And it's important. A surgeon told me recently that, being able to spend a lot of time cooking, was a great stress reliever, which made him a nicer person to work with at work. And I think is that something that resonates with you, or?
Oh, definitely. The simple pleasures in life. I enjoy cooking, and I enjoy my small family. One son who's also arguably even more of a petrol head than I am. And once he started watching things like Netflix, Drive to Survive, he never went back. He's a absolute addict, and in fact, there's no way he's going to do medicine. He wants to either do engineering or design or a combination of the two, and wants to work in F1.
Yeah.
So it's a pressure on me to try and find a way in, because it's a tough entry point getting into anything approaching one of the big F1 teams.
Very much so. And
Mm.
I know from the teams that I have known over the years, the bolters, as they call them, there's quite a dichotomy between the bolters, namely mechanics on each corner that bolt things on, and everyone else who has a laptop, who probably has a
Yes.
PhD.
Mm.
And a good friend of mine was a retired racing driver, the late Barry Williams, and he,
Wizzo Williams.
Wizzo Williams. He used to rent out his room in his house to various mechanics from F1 teams that were local to him in Silverstone. And the mechanics, would tell you that these legendary designers that were walking around, literally wouldn't be able to change a spark plug in the car, but they would be able to design the spark plug.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
They wouldn't
I
actually
think
know where it
James,
went.
yeah, yeah, my son's heading more towards the design side of
Yes,
things rather than the greasy spanner side of things. And he's currently reading Adrian Newey's book on how to design an F1 car,
it's
in
very,
which each chapter is a different car, usually championship winning,
yes,
because there is no better. So I'm glad he's taking that interest. But he does, as you say, he does need to go to university. He
yep.
needs to get a PhD in something around engineering before he has a chance.
It's a very interesting book that I've been fortunate enough to chat with Adrian Newey a few times, usually sitting waiting for a race in the Goodwood Revival, just in the
Yeah.
collecting area. And, he's a thoroughly nice guy to talk to, very
Mm.
humble and unassuming, but he clearly has there's a lot going on in the head
Yes.
as
Yeah.
you're talking
I think
to
he
him.
he runs a very well sorted E-type, like like you've got on the wall there.
Yes,
Yeah.
his E-Type spent a large amount of time in the wind tunnel at Red Bull. Um, I just to correct you, it is not like an E-Type that I have. I know that
Yeah.
car
Okay.
well, and it's a rocket ship, actually.
Yeah.
one of the original lightweights, one of the original level
yeah.
lightweights. It was the Essex wire car. So,
Mm.
segue. So two Land Rovers,
Yep.
iconic things, and then you've got transitioning towards exotica.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sort of transitioning away from my Mercedes AMG GTR at the moment, which is a fantastic car, but I'm always looking for a little bit of change. I like different engine configurations, so I'm thinking maybe I've never had a V12 or a V10, so I'm interested in something like that before I get too old to look stupid in one of these things. I don't think Italian Exotica always look particularly good in Devon. The lanes are a bit narrow for a start. Plus, I think people take a certain view of you. Maybe different in Florida, I'm sure it is. But yeah, so always thinking. Yeah.
Um, so I didn't have a GTR, but I had a GTS,
Mm,
which I thought was a spectacularly capable car. Um,
mm,
that was almost certainly going to result in loss of license,
mm.
because it doesn't like tootling around,
No.
and in fact, there's no point in
Yeah.
having it to
Yeah.
tootle around because
Mm,
I've had a series of AMGs, and one of my biggest gripes about them is that they have set to, I think, what's called comfort mode,
yes, that's right.
has
Yes.
the most dreadful turbo lag. Um,
Mm,
and so you have to set it to sport,
mm.
at least. And if you set it to sport, it is, I'm reliably informed by Mercedes insiders, is designed specifically to chew up the tires so that you have to buy new tires at an enormous amount of money every four to
Yeah.
5,000 miles.
I think the GTS is that's absolutely right in comfort mode, but the GTR's got a bit more about it, and so that's one way around it. Switch to a GTR. One of the best AMGs I had was the C63 naturally aspirated 6.3. That sounded wonderful,
Yes.
except the dog would never get in the back with the engine on, and
Well,
it was a good
I
car.
had a drop head version, the
Yeah.
cabriolet, and
Mm.
I thought it was a wonderful car in terms of every aspect, except that it had these two little side radiators at the bottom of the front,
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
I lost three radiators every 3 months. I would lose one because a stone would go through it. Uh,
Yeah.
and they eventually changed the design to put a grill in front of it because there was no grill in front of it,
Yeah.
which was very disappointing because I thought it was a lovely car. Now you say that the lanes of Devon, the country roads of Devon, are not wide enough, perhaps, for an old-fashioned Testarossa or something like that. But
Mm.
if I recall correctly, you do have an Aston Martin, which is not exactly known for being slim at the hips.
No, that's actually the GTR's wider than that,
Is
but
that?
you've got to be careful which roads you pick. I don't have the Vantage anymore, but that was yeah, that's narrow. I mean, the GTR was is wider as wide as my Range Rover Vogue. It's quite
Yeah.
quite a
The
thing to
modern
have.
cars are huge in
Mm,
general. I mean,
yeah,
anytime I take the E-Type somewhere and park it beside somewhere, you
yeah,
think that's like a miniature car.
yeah, yeah.
And it's hard to know where all that space is gone. I mean,
I
what's it
know,
for?
I know.
Um,
You park one of my modern cars next to the one I wouldn't sell, which is my TVR Griffith 96. And it looks tiny. And I got my son a Mazda or Miata MX-5 Mark II, and that looks even smaller next to these great big
yeah.
things. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you've answered one question for me, which was, if you could only have one, what would it be?
Of the cars I have, the TVR,
Yeah,
um, And you know that what's great about that, and you talk about cars in which you can't drive slowly. Well, there's one of the life's great experiences is burbling down a lane slowly in a V8, just
Yeah.
taking your time. And in fact, it's not a car because of its archaic transmission and lack of traction control, no ABS. Certainly, when there's gravel or moisture on the ground, you don't want to use your right foot at all. Um, but it's great fun, and when you do want to light it up in dry weather, it's brilliant. So that is a car of
So
great character.
that what year is that?
96, and it's the old Buick slash Rover
Yeah.
V8
Yeah.
pushrod engine, and it's the later version of it, which is the 5-liter high compression
Yeah.
engine. So it puts out about 340 brake. Yeah.
So you've never, at least I'm guessing you've never been tempted to go back, for example, to the original, something like the original Griffith, in the
Well,
60s
they're
with,
definitely. I mean, they're expensive. They're quite sought after and very rare, aren't they? The old
they
60s
are,
models.
they're
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
but, I
Mm.
mean, I'm unconvinced that it would be beyond you. Um,
I'd have to sell a few things, but
Well,
for sure.
indeed, don't we
Yeah.
all? But my
Yeah.
point being that you've
Mm.
tended, if I look at your either current or previous cars, you've tended to stay relatively modern rather than
Yeah.
go back into the
Definitely.
60s and
Yeah.
50s.
Yeah. But I probably step down a little bit next year, and looking forward to having more time to not only own these things but look after them.
Now, you've dabbled, I think, with what might be called supercars. I mean, you had the Vantage, obviously,
Yep.
but
Yep.
what else have you been in that arena?
Well, if you call it a supercar, I think one of the most capable cars out there is the Nissan GTR. Um, and not only in terms of its ability to go, but also to stop. I mean, that had the most astonishing brakes I've ever on a car of that weight. It must be about in European terms 1,700 kilograms. Incredible stopping power, but also amazing traction, amazing ability on a track. Just about anything. Most people wouldn't call that a supercar, more of a sports car. Originally it was one of the earlier R35s, so it was about 478 brake, and I had it chipped and had the exhaust change, so it's about 580. But those, as you know, go out to at least 1,000 brake with modifications. And just an astonishing all-round supercar at a fraction of the price of, say, a Turbo S. And then the other one I had was the McLaren 570, which again was remapped to 640, and that really is quite wild. You could spin the rear wheels
Yeah.
up even with traction control on in fourth gear. Yeah.
So um, the Skyline is always struck me as being something like a Marmite car, as in
Yeah. Yeah.
the aficionados, would consider that the term supercar was an understatement. I mean,
Mm,
and yet everyone else just dismisses them as being,
mm,
ugly and boring, etc. And they're
mm.
clearly quite polarizing in their opinion, but amazing performance. But
Yeah.
what was your how would you summarize your McLaren experience? I saw recently, um, and we briefly touched upon it. In general, never mind the current months, etc. The depreciation of supercars does
Mm.
vary, and McLaren and Aston Martin are amongst the worst depreciators.
Yeah.
Forget the depreciation. Their biggest complaint people have about McLarens is that they're not that reliable, and
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
service is
Yeah.
not good. How would you summarize your McLaren experience?
Well, firstly, I think looks-wise, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
Drivability and just everyday driving comfort on our dreadful roads in the UK was one of the best supercars out there. Power delivery astonishing. Yeah, build quality compared to the AMG GTR and a Porsche 911 is just not as good. And it would have some annoying little foibles, like if you left it for more than a week off charge, it would flatten its battery and scramble the ECU, and you'd be left in trouble, having to fumble under the wheel arch to pull a cable to get the front trunk open, so you could get some exposure to the terminals which were in the front to recharge it. So it just had that niggle, same way as Aston Martin's actually. The Advantage was a bit niggly like that, and every time you get into a like the AMG TR, it feels like it's been carved out of a single lump of granite, and never loses charge or shows its unreliability or build quality to be anything other than top draw. So yeah, the McLaren is a really lovely car to look at. I think a good test for a car is when you close your garage, whether you turn around quickly and have a little glance inside. And some cars pass that test, like Astons and McLarens. And you might not do that with the Nissan Skyline,
Yeah.
but you'd certainly enjoy being in the car. And the other thing I quite like with cars is people in the know. They wave and they give you a thumbs up,
Yeah.
and they look at a Skyline or R35, as we call them over here, the GTR, and you get a lot of kudos from people that know. And a bit with the AMG GTR as well, because a lot of people look at it and think, well, it's just an SL with a hardtop on it or whatever, and but ones that know realize that it's got certain characteristics: the power, the delivery, the aero, the noise, and so I quite enjoy cars that are a little bit, cause people to put their thumbs up, whereas some cars cause people to put two fingers up at you, if you know what I mean. Certainly in the
Yes.
UK, where they have that rather malignant envy for people that buy these cars.
Which is obviously something that's keeping you away from a Rosso red Ferrari.
Yeah, I've certainly I think maybe I need to move to the south of France, John, and then I'll buy that Ferrari with the
Yeah.
Lapco fund when it
So
when it gets there.
talk to me about Lapco. You are
Yeah.
you are the Lapco guy internationally, as you know. There's somewhere in the history of Lapco there'll be one or two of my fingerprints,
Absolutely.
but
Very much so.
well,
Yeah.
but you took it and ran with it for how many years?
7 years. I think you left in '08,
Mm-hmm.
and I took over and ran it until 2014-15, in the UK, National Training Program for Laparoscopic Colorectal Surgery, as for consultants or surgeons, for those that don't know. And as you know, we published extensively with George Hanna, the prof from Imperial College St
Mm-hmm.
Mary's, and that led to the attraction and interest from abroad, including the United States, and ended up going to places like, SAGE's meetings all over the States, but working in Houston with Brian Duncan when he was at Houston Methodist Medical Center and the Mighty Center there.
Yeah.
And then in other specialties in places like Australia, we have a faculty, Lapco faculty in gynecology. We have faculties that teach our courses in Norway, Denmark. We run courses in Istanbul for surgeons from over 100 countries now. And it's all around how to maximize the efficiency and impact of surgical training. Oftentimes around laparoscopic surgery, but we also now work with robotic
Yeah.
companies, using our train the trainers principles.
Yeah.
And we have contracts with robotic companies to do that all over the world. Currently working in South America, Middle East, going out to India, and of course Europe and the UK and so on.
So
Yeah.
Lapco originally was a Department of Health initiative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Lapco that you're referring to now is a
Mm.
separate entity that you spun off, if you like. And
Yeah.
so a couple of questions. What happened to the Department of Health bit, the original Lapco?
Yeah.
Um,
The National Cancer Action Team, led by Professor Sir Mike Richards, that unit got dissolved, and at a time when we wished to continue training, particularly to address rectal cancer and so on laparoscopically, the Department of Health pulled the funding. By then, we were into the recession in the early, 2010s, 11s, 12s.
yeah,
So the funding disappeared. The Department of Health, they decided to cancel the program, nothing to do with us. But from that arose the Lapco International Consultancy, where we started to form relationships between surgeons and companies and us to open doors, and to leverage, our ideas for surgical training in other parts of the world. So it's been working quite well now. Yeah.
I recall asking Mike Richards at the beginning what the aspiration was, and he's quite the pragmatist, Mike Richards. And I was expecting a detailed scientific answer, and he was very explicit. He said, by the time of the London Olympics, 2012, I want it to be that any patient in the UK with colon cancer would either have or have access to a laparoscopic colorectal operation. Um, if I was to ask you today, how would you look back on that as an aspiration and a deliverable?
Yeah, I remember in 2008-09, one of the first thing we did was to survey every, I think, 164
Mm-hmm.
hospitals in England that did colon cancer, to say, are you doing no, a little, or a lot of laparoscopic
Yeah,
colon resection? And we ascertained that around half were doing a significant volume, half were not, and a very small number were doing, none. So we had to really focus in on the hospitals where little or none was being done, and that very much was our mantra. And I like that story about 2012. That's a neat way of encapsulating it, because once and the big thing I think that opened the door was giving everybody a really approachable website where they could upload each training case
yeah,
and linked that to funding. So we gave, I think, £800, British pounds, for each training episode, by asking each episode to be accompanied by one of the online assessment forms.
yeah,
No form, no money. You do your form, you get your money. And that really, within a year, I think, by 2010 or so, we had around 1,000 or 1,200 cases registered, which is a huge volume of
yeah,
material, accompanied by all the data that George Hanna and colleagues crunched into various papers.
yeah,
So I think actually by 2012, we sort of realized that we're all well down that journey. We didn't insist on people doing in-reach or outreach training or immersion. We just allowed flexibility. All we insisted upon was, you're not dealing with trainees, or residents. You're dealing with consultants or surgeons. You need to give them the tools and show them how to do the job. And those simple things, I think, really resulted in success. And if you look at the National Bowel Cancer Audit data from the 2007 going through to about 2015, you went from less than 10% laparoscopic versus open up to 60 or 70%
yeah,
laparoscopic versus
yeah.
open. So many of those measures, it was a success. Thanks to all the efforts of the, surgeons providing the training, and the surgeons willing to be trained, because as we know, surgeons are not always characterized by their willingness to be retrained. So
For
I think
sure.
that was,
Yeah.
it
No, it's
was
been
it was
a
almost like a wave of momentum. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's, I think enormous credit to you and your colleagues. It has been the template internationally, which is why, of course, the model that you have now has become so successful internationally, because it's, you know, I do not think there's a better model that has been executed better anywhere. So kudos to you and your colleagues. So in the few minutes that we have left, couple of, you know, topical items and a couple of cheesy items. So the topical item is what about retirement?
Yeah, so I was 59 last week, and fortunately, touch wood, in good health, and looking forward to what we call, and has become a reality recently, for retire and return, or flexible retirement in the NHS, where you can take your pension at the age of 60 or whenever you want to, and continue working, and in fact contributing to whatever pension pot you want to. They've changed the law because of tax penalties that were forcing people like myself to retire and not return. So that's my plan. The Lapco consultancy is becoming ever busier. We're looking to generate a digital platform, if you like, that mirrors very much the work that we did in the original program, because we realize that a lot of countries, systems, residency programs around the world don't have access to a really good joined up online system for formative assessment, for summative assessment, to have a portfolio of their training activities, which needs to be either low cost or cost free as well, bearing in mind that we want to work in high, middle, and low income countries as well. So we think there's a real market for that kind of things. There's an ongoing demand for our Train the Trainers course, which is one of the most rigorously assessed courses on the planet for surgeons, to both elevate their skills of being a surgeon and being most importantly, a trainer as well. So that's been busy. I run a local charity called Bowel Cancer West, which is, like many charities, really struggled through the pandemic.
Yeah.
We do a lot of car-related things to raise awareness, which is nice, because it attracts in a key demographic of middle-aged men, and talks about symptoms and health and
Yes.
fitness and diet, which is really important. And many people don't know that the southwest of England actually is an area where there's a lot of social deprivation, which not many people realize. So yeah, there's a lot to do. I've got the family, child of 16 who's doing well at school, and property to look after. So many exciting prospects.
So what would you, if a young aspiring doctor says to you today, I'm thinking of doing surgery in the NHS, what's your soundbite for that person?
I think once you've got to that point of realization, I mean, if you're talking about somebody who's been through medical school, then I think it's one of the best careers to still get into, and I think there is much greater opportunity for, particularly for women, to go into surgery these days. And we have, it seems to me, more than half of our current residents or registrars are female, and I think it's to be encouraged. And
Yeah.
only in the next 2 or 3 years we're going to go from having, I think, maybe 2 or 3 out of 20 general surgeons in my hospital being female, to getting on towards 5, 6, 7, 8. And I think that'll be fantastic. They bring their own skill sets, their own conscientiousness and ability, and they'll complement what we do, and only add to our things. So I encourage people to go into surgery. Definitely.
And so you're optimistic for the future, despite all
We
the
have we have to be. I hope
yeah,
to be around to bring in my successors as consultants,
yeah.
so they can look after me when I become old and crumbly.
Okay, so we'll finish off with just with a few more light-hearted questions. So, the car you regret selling most?
Oh, there's a good one. I think something slightly different actually. I used to have an Audi RS6
Hmm.
Avant, and there is absolutely nothing better for going to the south of France or the Alps
Yeah.
down the péage, and you'd get, say, a 911 coming up behind you, not quite realizing what they were behind, and doing that continental thing of flashing and you putting their outside indicator on until the traffic cleared, and then they'd realize they'd come up against something of a greater ability than them. That was fun. Then you realize you were doing 150 and you need to slow down.
Exactly. The biggest disappointment in a car?
Yeah, that would probably be, oh, that's a difficult one. The Mark II Golf GTI was just a bit too vanilla compared to the Mark
Yeah.
One, and I had that and sold it just before we went to Australia back in the 90s, and it was unreliable and just didn't have the character of the original GTI.
And the one that surprised you in terms of being better than you thought it was going to be?
I think the R35, this Skyline,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's such
Yeah.
a capable car, but there are hopefully many more cars to come.
Well, and so that leads me to the last question, which was with an open checkbook, what would it be?
An open and blank checkbook, I think I would have a McLaren F1.
Because of the style, because of the engine, because of what?
One of those cars you sort of grew up with, one of the most iconic supercars of its time and still is.
Yeah.
I loved it. I loved its looks, the fact that it didn't have any obvious aero on it, had an NAV12, and things that interested a young man like gold leaf in the engine bay.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Plenty of
And
titanium and other fancy alloys.
and some quite posh looking, ridiculously shaped luggage, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It
Yeah,
always amuses me. I had a friend in upstate New York who ordered a Ferrari Pista,
yeah.
very optioned,
Mm.
etc. And I said to him, I remember saying to him, "Did you order the luggage?" And his answer to that, absolutely true. He said, "No, I did not." He said, "That luggage is very expensive, you know." I mean, I
Yeah,
think he just spent close on 700,000 for the
yeah,
thing, but he didn't want to be
yeah,
ridiculous. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
well, on that note, Mark, I'm really grateful you spent so much time with us today. We'll be going live with these very soon. I'll let you know. If
Thank you.
please don't hesitate to send me any links you would like put on the YouTube element. For example, the charity and
Yeah,
Lapco
will
and
do.
various
Will do.
things,
Yeah,
and
will do.
you never know, it might make you famous.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's lovely to see you looking so well, John, and thanks for the
Thanks, Mark.
opportunity. All
Thanks
the
so much.
best.
Bye now.